In the process of understanding the relationship between language and society, we will look at the situation of English in India. We are starting to look at a new topic, and English appears to be one of the most significant languages not only in the country, but also around the world. We will try to examine underlying reasons, and also we will try to look at the significance of the language English in India and how such a thing helps us understand the complexity between language and society, that is the complexities in terms of the relationship between language and society. A discussion on English is an important one in the context of this course and also in the context of understanding such a complex relationship between language and society, because it has a different status of its own in the society, and like I mentioned, not only Indian society, but societies around the world. As a matter of coincidence, it has acquired a status of prestige. It has acquired the status of upward mobility. It is a symbol of upward mobility, and the ability to use English in the society has a completely different connotation and meaning in terms of how we work with language in society. So, we would want to look at these dynamics, particularly when English comes in picture while understanding language and society both. We have heard terms like Indian English. Let us start with this term Indian English vis-a-vis English, and we need to understand what this means in the technical context. As a matter of coincidence, once again, just as English is marker of prestige in the society, it is a marker of distinct identity in the society. The term Indian English is used as a stigmatized variety. To the speakers of English in India, if it is pointed out that you are a speaker of Indian English, they feel offended. That is, the speakers of Indian English would feel offended. In the process, somehow the term Indian English has got a stigmatized symbol. Now, this requires our understanding, and such an understanding will help us understand language and society little bit more clarity. Why would this happen? If English is an important marker of distinction, English is a marker of superior identity, and I am using these terms with responsibilities. English is a marker of higher status symbol, then why would Indian English, the term, would be considered as an stigmatized one? The answer to this question opens many facets, and it helps us understand the idea of upward mobility. We will get back to that also pretty soon. But the answer is located in the question of standard and non-standard. Technically speaking, distinction between standard and non-standard when it comes to the question of language does not exist. It's not at all a matter of consideration in technical understanding of language. However, when we look at language from the social perspectives, sociological perspectives, it means a lot, and it becomes an empirical fact that languages are looked at with these two terms. Some are standard and some are non-standard. We have looked at the question of language and variety. We will be looking at the question of language and variety with one more perspective pretty soon. But the question of standard and non-standard are going to exist within the varieties as well. Some certain varieties are considered more standard and some varieties are considered less standard, rather non-standard. The same thing applies to English. Certain types of English is considered standard and rest of them are considered non-standard. Probably the term Indian English refers to non-standard English, or it has been equated with what is considered non-standard. We get back to this again to the point in combination of the two. However, a new perspective comes in while looking at the term Indian English. It means English in India. The language English, the way it is spoken in India, is referred to as Indian English. So, we can call it Indian English or we can call it English in India. The next term English in India and equally so Indian English tells us that it is one of the types of Englishes, and definitely the fact that we need an adjective Indian, English refers to something else. To resolve this book length discussion on this topic, Rajendra Singh and Ramakant Agnihotri in 2012, they propose a very significant point, not so obliquely, but the point is very significant. Singh argues that the term English in India should really be considered as English of India, and he substantiates his point by a very strong argument, which is like the argument of language acquisition device or universal grammar, in the sense that it is pretty hard to refute. On the basis of varieties of evidence, he points out that after such a long presence of the language in the country or in the subcontinent, the English that has groomed itself in this subcontinent along with other large number of languages spoken in the subcontinent has got a pretty distinct identity of its own. Therefore, such an English is should be called English of India, like in the sense that English happens to be one of the languages of this subcontinent like any other. So, what we know as Indian English or English in India has got a distinct identity from any other types of English that we know of. Therefore, the distinction between English and India and English of India is pretty significant. And the fact that, to quote Singh, the fact that Indian English gets in its own identity in the linguistic ecology of the subcontinent is what has given English it a new identity. Probably this would apply to all other Englishes as well, but he definitely argues that for Indian English. Therefore, the term should be used as English of India. It becomes even more interesting in the context of the term native speakers, and then again we will look at this list in the reverse order. The term English native speaker is significant while understanding language English. Pretty often we get stuck with the question, who are the native speakers of English? And then to compare that with the significance of such a question in the context of the current discussion, what is the status of speakers of English in India? Then this concept of native speakers of English becomes clearer in the light of Singh's proposal, Singh and Agnihotri's proposal, that English of India is an independent language of Indian subcontinent, and it has the identity of this subcontinent like any other language is spoken in the subcontinent. So, the speakers of Indian English are the native speakers of English in India, are the native speakers of Indian English. And this description is in sync with the term native speaker, the way we have understood before in this course. Such a definition of native speaker that we have tried to look at in this course so far follows from how people acquire language, and then if we apply the same to Indian English, we get to learn that the term native speaker, once applied to Indian English, it is pretty much evident that the speakers of English in India are the native speakers of Indian English. This gets pretty clear by looking at different parts of English in little bit details as the structure of Indian English. We will get to that part also, but let us look at it in the reverse order to understand the question of standard and non-standard in the context of Indian English. If we bring in the points raised by Singh and Agnihotri in 2012, then the term Indian English should not be looked at or should not be pointed to as an stigmatized term. However, it is important to mention it as a footnote of this discussion that any kind of stigma to the term Indian English has not been added by anyone else but the speakers of Indian English themselves. So, the term English of India and the rationale underlying the term genesis of India helps the speakers of Indian English get out of this and consider the term Indian English not only as one of the variants of one of the variants among different types of English and one of the variants of one superstructure called English, rather it has its own identity in Indian linguistic ecology. Therefore, no stigma. Therefore, native speakers of Indian English are the speakers of English in India, and there are huge bunch of evidence available for that. We will look at some of them pretty soon, and therefore, the technical understanding of the terms standard and non-standard remains theoretically applicable in the domains of sociolinguistics and social understanding of language, that they do not really mean much once we look at the terms carefully. Hope this helps clarify the term Indian English. However, going a step backward, it is true that English spoken in and around Buckingham Palace in London was considered the English, and everything else was substandard, non-standard varieties of English. So, if speakers of English did not belong to the vicinity of Buckingham Palace of British Empire in London, they were speakers, non-standard speakers of English. And it was British Empire was not directly responsible for propagating English around the world. And this needs a careful understanding with a caution. It happened along the way, that is, the spread of English happened along with the spread of empire, So, what happens is, speakers of English who tried to speak like the representatives of empire always wanted to be speaking like the empires, the representatives of empires. And therefore, they accepted themselves as speakers of non-standard English. So, just like the term Indian English is looked down upon not by anyone else, but the speakers of Indian English themselves, the speakers of English who did not belong to the inner group or in and around areas of Buckingham Palace really believed themselves to be the speakers of non-standard English. This is a pretty complex phenomenon, but equally simple to look at it in terms of its understanding, and it becomes even simpler that varieties of English around the world were not only looked down upon in terms of non-standard only when they were spoken outside England. In fact, they were looked down upon within England itself. Irish English or Scottish English still are not considered any kind of prestige variety of spoken English. There are several varieties of English spoken within England, and there is nothing surprising about that. That is the nature of language. The existing variation within language happens to be universal nature of language, and these things have implications for politics and society of Europe and around the world, but we do not have the mandate to go there. We would want to understand in the light of the current background of the difference between English spoken by a handful of speakers in and around Buckingham Palace and rest of the speakers. This debate was pretty significant for a long time. Speakers and particularly researchers on this topic finally succeeded in treating rest of the varieties as varieties of English spoken around the world. And in that, one of the in forefront comes one of the names of Cartridge, and he comes up with a model which is called Cartridge Model of 1986, in which he proposes 3 circles. It's a pretty simple, pretty famous phenomena that the terms inner circle, outer circle and expanding circles are known as 3-circle formula of Cartridge. And he points out that the countries like USA, UK, Canada, Australia are part of inner circles where English is spoken largely as the language of these places. He has more reasons to be putting in countries in inner circle, outer circle or expanding circles, but the division between these circles is also pretty interesting, and his rationale for putting these countries in these circles are relevant as well. So, India belongs to outer circle where it is spoken by lot of people and also it becomes part of the government functioning. And then there are countries like China, Japan and many others around the world and particularly in East Asia where they are put in expanding circle because the language English is not that significant for the functioning of the government as well. So, this distinction is pretty clear based on certain assumptions, and this came to be very significant, very powerful tool for understanding Englishes around the world, and also has huge contribution in accepting different varieties of English, being considered not as a substandard variety of English, but merely a variety of English. So, the language spoken in Africa would be African English, and languages spoken in India will be called Indian English or Chinese English or Japanese English, but they are not substandard varieties of English, they have their own distinct identities. And it is not in direct contrast with anything else. The argument that I have tried to bring in this discussion from Singh and Agnihotri is in sync with this, where they take the argument a step further and they say, because of the coexistence of this language, and take India as a case study, for a long period of time with other languages of the country or the subcontinent, it has developed in such a way that it has acquired Indian identity, and therefore it is English of India, and it should be looked at as English of India and not in contrast with American English or British English, Canadian English, African English or Australian English, or for that matter any English. They should not be looked at in terms of contrast, they should be looked at as their independent identities. Of course, there are similarities, but it has got its own independent identity, and that gives people independent identity, and therefore, that reduces the substandard load from English spoken in India. All right. So, we move to the next part of this discussion, which is little bit more technical in terms of understanding why the success that lies in Cartridge model, that English spoken around the world should be considered as independent varieties of Englishes, as Englishes that is part of inner circle, and also this substantiate the claim of Singh and Agnihotri that it has acquired its own identity, are located in the study of these 4 levels of phonological, morphological, syntactic and discourse study of one variety of English, that is Indian English. And we will take just a few examples to substantiate our point here. When we look at phonological features of Indian English, we find that retroflex sounds are part of Indian English. We have had a discussion on our understanding of language in terms of sounds, words and sentences. Even as part of this course, we have briefly looked at how language is a rule governed system and how it looks as a rule governed system when we look at the language from the perspective of understanding it at the level of sounds, words and sentences. So, when we look at the sounds, we find that the sounds of Indian languages in particular, and in our discussion of India as a linguistic area, we have seen how retroflex sounds are part of Indian subcontinent and how it got spread into languages, several languages spoken in this subcontinent. Therefore, its retroflex sounds are part of repertoire of every speaker of this subcontinent, and hence when English is spoken by these many people, the retroflex sounds became integral part of English spoken in India. The examples are in place of an alveolar, we find either a dental or a retroflex in Indian English. So, when we want to say a word like table, we end up saying table, where ta in Indian English would really become ta, which is a retroflex sound. It is not a surprising fact at all, it just marks Indian English at a phonological level. There is a rule as part of English phonology which says a stop sound, a voiceless stop like pa, ta and ka would get aspirated syllable initially in English. So, a word like car is going to sound aspirated initially and it would end up sounding like car. A word like pin would in English sound like pin. However, what we are looking at here is car will never be aspirated in Indian English and it will be spoken as car. The phonological explanation for this is very simple, that k and k are two distinct phonemes in any language of this subcontinent or many languages of this subcontinent, and definitely they are phonemes, independent phonemes in Hindi. However, k and k could be two different allophones of the same phoneme in English, and that we get to understand why we have lack of aspiration at syllable initial position in Indian English. Similarly, so this can be explained in terms of first language influence, and a more detailed discussion on second language acquisition helps us understand that the maturity of vocal tract is also responsible for why some of these things would happen and some of these things would not happen in Indian English at a phonological level, that is at the level of sounds. Because the muscles and the movement of muscles get matured and then it does not work the way we want to train it again. So, Indian English is going to be full of retroflex sounds, it is never going to aspirate a voiceless stop syllable initially, and they will always be replaced by an alveolar sound, and that can only be looked at as first language influence, because most of the languages spoken in this subcontinent have got retroflex sounds in them, and the two pairs like aspirated and unaspirated stop sounds are going to be two distinct phonemes in these languages. When we look at lexical level or morphological level, to say it with more clarity, that is at the level of words, we find a great thing on the level of plural formation. Because we are looking at the written part of the language, we often tend to pronounce plural markers in a variety of ways. However, there are only two plural markers in English, one is sa, the other is za, and the distinction between the two is voicing, where ja is an unmarked plural and sa is a devoiced variant of the plural marker, which happens when a word ends with a stop sound. The plural marker that it takes becomes devoiced and sounds as sa. However, so we do not look at plural markers in English as sa or za, rather we would want to, we end up putting a sa sound where we should be putting za, precisely because we are looking at only the written aspects of this language, and therefore, as part of Indian English, the English spoken in India, the English of India, a word like friends can be spoken as friends. That is, take a word friend, take a word flower, and when you have the plural marking on it, the reason why orthographic symbol S is added to this, we end up putting a plural marker in spoken language as well, which gets represented as sa sound. However, that is not the case, but this explains why that a phenomena would take place in English spoken in Indian subcontinent. We take examples of few words. It will have its own vocabulary, and it is possible that they do not match with some of them in a different variety of English. So, for the term proctor, we find in Indian English invigilator. The term mad, we have angry in Indian English, and for the term neighborhood, we have the term colony. But these are pretty insignificant insignificant markers of why Indian English should be considered as English of India, but rest of them are pretty strong rationale of why this has developed its independent identity. Finally, when we look at sentences, and again there are examples available in all parts of the understanding of sentences, which is also called syntax, but I would like to put only two examples here. One first comes from question tag. In place of, take the example on the screen, he will win the election, won't he? Instead of this, or she writes well, doesn't she? In our English, we end up saying, he will win the election, isn't it? Or she writes well, no? Now, look at the tags at the end, isn't it or no? They again come from the way our languages are structured. So, it is a direct transfer at the level of syntax to the English spoken in this subcontinent. And this is not, this should not be looked at again as problematic English, as non-standard English, because this is not done by few speakers. This happens as a whole. Therefore, he will win the election, isn't it, is a legitimate marker of how English spoken in this subcontinent has got its independent identity and why it should be looked at English of India. There are hundreds of examples of this type, but again all of them put together would make the same point. Take one more example. It requires lot more details, but the question marking is a very important phenomena in English. So, when we question anything, the question word appears at the sentence initial position, and put it in a non-technical sense, the tense marker also moves with the WH word and appears next to that. However, in the embedded clause, this happens in an independent clause. However, in an embedded clause, there is no auxiliary inversion that is allowed in English. So, the sentences that will come in English are Ravi knows what he is doing. Ravi knows, but in our variety, which could be put for the time being, I have put it as marked. So, look at the set of examples. Ravi knows what he is doing. In our variety, which I have put as marked, Ravi knows what is he doing. Ravi knows what is he doing. This is a pretty common expression, this is a pretty common phenomena that happens in such sentences in Indian English. Now, instead of putting it as marked, the argument is this is the phenomena of Indian English, just like in English spoken elsewhere, there is no aux inversion in embedded clauses. In Indian English, there is aux inversion in embedded clauses. So, there is the distinction is not in terms of marked and unmarked. The distinction is in terms of how these things appear at large when people speak this variety of English. We do not know where are we headed to, or we do not know where are we going to in Indian English. It's a technical thing to explain. However, the argument here is what I have put as marked on the screen should be looked at a phenomena of Indian English and can only be described as this is not the aux inversion happens in Indian English that explains Indian English, that explains how Indian English has got its own identity at the level of sentences. So, we have looked at in a technical sense with limited examples at the level of sounds, words, and particularly I am referring to morphological example of plural formation, and then the examples of auxiliary inversion and question tag at the level of sentence. And if you keep your ears open, you will find hundreds of such examples when people speak English in India at large. Therefore, these things should be looked at as the markers of Indian English, which gives English of India a distinct identity, and it helps us understand why it does not remain a variety of any other types of English, rather it is of its own type. Please add the total number of speakers of English in this country is much larger than the speakers of English of the countries of inner circle. That will be of course an hypothesis, but that will also help us understand that it is not the question of numbers of speakers, it is based on how English is spoken in a systematic fashion. Anything that requires systematic explanation, anything that becomes part of systematic explanation and that can be explained in a systematic way cannot be and must not be looked at as something substandard happening in the language. Thank you.